All right, so we're starting a new series called Follow Me, and in this series, we're going to look at the 12. Now, you might be like, the 12 what? Well, the 12 disciples. You might be like, there's only 12? Actually, there's way more than 12, but Jesus chose 12 specific people that would be his kind of closest disciples who would eventually become the 12 apostles, and we'll explain all that in a little bit. So, but before we get started, I want to ask you guys, what do you guys know about the apostles? What do we know about them, or the disciples? Yeah. Nice, 12. What else do we know? Or what do you guys think about? Like, when you think, maybe this is a better word, not necessarily know about them. When you think of the 12 disciples, what comes to mind?
Okay, so you guys hit some of the ones I got here. So here's some things we know about them. Ordinary men, right? Unschooled, just ordinary dudes. Some of them are fishermen, some of them are tax collectors. Some of them we actually don't know what their occupation was, or if they even had one. We also know that they were quite brash. When you read the account of the Gospels, when you read the story about Jesus and his disciples, like sometimes you just have to laugh because these guys are pretty funny and they say some pretty funny things, and you're like kind of scratching your head going like, huh, wow, the disciples asked that, right? So, we already hit this one. They were unlikely characters, right? Fishermen, like just, again, the ordinary, regular dudes. Regular dudes. What else? So here's one of the things that from Jewish culture that we would know, that if you were older than 12 and hadn't already been picked by a rabbi, which means a teacher, to follow him as his disciples, then that means you were passed over. Like the best of the best. That they only picked, these rabbis or scribes, they only picked the best of the best, the brightest, right? And so by age 13, if you hadn't kind of been scouted by the scribes, then you would just follow in your parents or your father's whatever he was doing, you would do, right? So we'll actually find that next week, actually, in our story. And so most likely these guys had been passed over already, right? And maybe, and this, Nate, thank you very much. I was waiting for that one. Maybe old guys with beards. Maybe. Isn't that the picture we kind of get sometimes in the movies? And how about this? I have a picture here. It's a very famous picture, very famous painting. And what stands out? They look pretty old. Some of them are like bald. Right? Some of them are bald, the big beards, they look old, right? Except for Jesus, he looks like a lady. Right? It's the style of art at the time, right? What else stands out that you think maybe has misinformed us about the disciples? Yeah, it's like, what? You notice that they're all European looking? Right? So it's not bad that this is a famous painting, is awesome. But one of the things about paintings often is it's reflective of the painter's culture, right? And so this, of course, is you can see all of the elements, the European elements in this. Now, this is what stands out is that all these guys are of European descent, right? They're all white dudes, but none of the disciples were white, as far as we know, and neither was Jesus. They were all Jewish, so Middle Eastern. Right? So they would have most likely had darker skin, dark hair, including Jesus. He wouldn't have had flowing blonde locks. Right? And so, yeah. And so you can see how we can kind of get a misrepresentation of who they are. Okay, we can go to the next slide there, Everett. So here's the one where Nate kind of said, it's possible. In fact, not just possible, it's very, very probable that they were quite young. And so all the disciples, except for Peter and probably Levi Matthew, were most likely under the age of 20. And we find this from some of the stories in the New Testament. One specifically in the Gospels is from Matthew chapter 17. And so it's actually, during that time, if you went to the temple, you had to pay what was called a temple fee or a temple tax. And so if you were under 20, you had to pay this tax. And Peter and Jesus are having a conversation, and they don't have any money. So Peter's like, what are we going to do? And Jesus says, go get a fish out of the lake and bring it back, and we'll pay for it. So Peter goes, gets fish, and of course in the fish's mouth is the coin that's needed to allow Jesus and Peter in. What this suggests is that the other 11 didn't have to pay the temple tax. And so they would have been under 20 years old. And so now I know we don't know for sure, but I think something, at least for me, happens when I think about these guys being really young. And I hope that kind of comes out in this series of Follow Me. It makes sense for some of the conversations and things that they say. And if you think about James and John's mom talking to Jesus about trying to gain them position, you wouldn't do that for a grown man. Like, these guys were kids. They were young. And so there's lots of these indications. And so I really believe that this was Jesus' youth group. Peter was the only one that we know of that was married because he had a mother-in-law. And so Peter was probably a little bit older. And Levi, since Levi Matthew was called later, became a disciple later than some of these other ones, he already had a profession, and he was a tax collector. And so he was probably a little bit older as well. But the tradition was you wouldn't be older than your rabbi. And so for sure, they were all under 30. But I would say at least 10 of these guys were under 20. So it's just crazy. Some people speculate that John, the guy who wrote the book of John, which we're going to be in, could have been as young as 13. So I don't know, that's pretty cool. All right. The other thing that we're going to highlight throughout these stories that we're going to go through is that Jesus sought them out. Like, they weren't chance meetings. They weren't coincidences. That Jesus actually sought these guys out and chose them specifically, which is really cool to think of because, again, they're just ordinary dudes. Nothing stood out about them. And eventually, these ordinary guys would become what we know as the apostles who started the church, who started the Christian movement. They're the ones that got it all started. So, very cool. All right, and so if you're wondering what apostle means, apostle simply means sent person or sent one. So, and the capital A apostles stand for the 12 apostles. All right, and so here's just a quick list. I'm not going to spend any time here. This is just a list of names. So there's Simon Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, who they think, this is not for sure, was renamed from Nathaniel. So this could be Nathaniel. That's what church tradition teaches us. And then there's Matthew, who was Levi Matthew. So his original name was Levi. And then there's Thomas, who is famous for what? Would that not suck if that was your legacy? 2,000 years later, people are calling you, oh, I know Thomas. That's Doubting Thomas. It's like, ah. And then there's another Simon, who was a zealot, who was called the Zealot. So you guys know what a zealot is? It's someone who was a sworn enemy of Rome. And some of the crazy things that I can't get into it too much today, but some of the crazy things that these guys would do is like they were sworn that if they found a Roman soldier or someone alone, that they would try to kill him. Like, it was like these guys were like serious dudes, and they believed that they needed to get rid of the Romans completely. All right, so there's Simon the Zealot, and then there's Judas, which sucks for number 11, Judas, because he's Judas, the son of James. Remember, I'm the son of James. I'm not the other Judas. And then maybe the most famous of all the disciples, or infamous, is Judas Iscariot, who is also a zealot. And so, Judas is probably unfortunately, the most well-known. All right, so that's the 12. When we talk about the 12, that's the 12. Now, in Acts, there was 11 apostles, and they added another dude to fill up the number 12, which is important, but that's not for today. All right, so that's the 12. We're going to get into John chapter 1, and we're going to read this story, and it is a story of Jesus' first meeting with some of his disciples. Not all of them, just a handful. And so we're going to start in verse 35 and we read to verse 51. Now, just to kind of give you context, what's happening here. Okay, so John the Baptist is this guy. He's really strange. He's wearing like animal skins and he's eating like locusts or like big grasshoppers and with honey. And it's just kind of like, ooh, this guy is really strange. And he's one of the things he's famous for is baptizing people. And here's the Pharisees or the religious leaders at the time had just had a conversation with him. And they're asking, who are you? Are you Elijah? And he's like, no, I'm John, I think. Are you the prophet? And they're talking about this prophet that's in the Old Testament that was supposed to come. And he's like, no. Well, who are you then? They're asking him. And he's like, well, I'm the one who's calling out in the wilderness, prepare the way. Right? So what he's saying is, I'm here to announce someone else. And so, later that day, Jesus is walking along and John sees him and he's like, behold, or look, it's the Lamb of God, right? And so it's like, oh, everyone's like, was like, what? Because the Lamb of God, like, what is he talking about? And it's I'm going to explain it actually when we get to it in our passage. And so we come to this passage, this is the very next day. The next day, John was there again with two of his disciples. When he saw Jesus passing by, he said, look, the Lamb of God. So what he's referring to is the Jewish sacrificial system. In order to take away sin, an animal had to die, had to shed his blood. Like, in our culture, we're like, ugh, what? Wow, that's disgusting or that's cruel or whatever. But to them, this was how the sin was, it's called atoned for. And so when John pointed out Jesus and he's calling him a lamb. Well, that's kind of weird. Like a lamb's a lamb, right? How can this guy be a lamb to take away the sins of the world? This is interesting. And so he had already announced this, and this is the second time that he does this. When the two disciples heard him say this, and so these disciples would be John's disciples, they followed Jesus, right? So they left John and followed Jesus because of something he had just said was super significant. John was pointing out that this is the one that he was supposed to announce. This is why I'm here. There he is. And so these disciples followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, what do you want? Now I want to remind you just momentarily, just think, as a teenager, approaching someone that you think is like amazing, and this person's older, how do you strike up a conversation, right? So it's interesting that Jesus speaks first, right? So it gives me the impression that these young guys are just kind of coming up to Jesus and they're just looking at him. And they want to talk to him, but they don't know what to say. And so Jesus starts the conversation. He says, what do you want? So what do you think they're going to say? Well, this is what they say. Rabbi, which means teacher. Where are you staying? Okay. Let's stop for a moment again. So if you're in an uncomfortable situation and you really like this person and you think this person is amazing and you just really want to talk to them, but you don't know what to say, and they go like, oh, hi, what do you want? How do you respond? Where do you live? Right? Where are you staying? Right? So two things are happening here. I think because they're young, they don't know what to say, but also they're interested. They want to know where he's staying, like, because they want to hang out with him. And so Jesus, of course, knows what they're doing. And he says, come, he replied, and you will see. So they went and saw where he was staying. And they spent that day with him, which means that, it says it was about 4 p.m, so they would have spent the evening, probably stayed overnight, wherever he was staying. All right, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard what John had said and had followed Jesus. So we've identified one of these two disciples was Andrew. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, We have found the Messiah, which means the Christ, right? The person who is coming in the line of David, the person in the Old Testament that we've been waiting for many, 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 many years. We have found the Messiah, that is the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. Okay, so Andrew brings him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, now, just think about how odd this is. You've never met this person before. Jesus looks at him and says, you are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas. Okay, just for a second, can we put ourselves in Peter's shoes? So this is his first meeting with Jesus. And his brother Andrew's got, you got to come see this guy. Look, this is awesome. This is what John the Baptist said about him. Come see him. And so he comes, and the first thing Jesus says to him is like, you're Simon, son of John. It's like, oh, yeah, that's right. That's who I am. And then Jesus renames him. Now, this is super significant. I can't spend a lot of time on it, but it's super significant. It happens throughout the Old Testament in a number of different situations when somebody is commissioned by God for something special. For instance, Abram in the Old Testament and Sarai. They were renamed by God to Abraham and Sarah, right? And so he gives them this new name because he's got a new purpose for them. And so this is what he's doing with Peter. He hasn't met him. And what's really funny is as you read the story, if you know the story of the disciples, he's renaming Peter Rock, right? And Peter most certainly does not fit the bill at the start. But here's the great thing about Jesus, and we'll see this in the next little few verses. Jesus knows him already. He already knows who Peter's going to be. Eventually, Peter would become that rock that Jesus renamed him. But he most certainly took a long time to do it. All right, let's keep going. Okay, so Cephas, which is, when translated, is Peter. So that's, if you're wondering where Peter and why they call him Simon Peter, it's because his original name was Simon, Jesus named Peter. The next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee, finding Philip. We got another character entering the picture here. Finding Philip, he said to him, "Follow me." Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. So they probably knew each other, right? It's like, hey, because it wasn't that big of a town. It was a pretty small town. Philip found Nathanael. So, now we got another name here coming. So Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law," which means the Old Testament, "and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? So that's his response, right? Nathanael asked, okay, yeah. Come and see. Because Nazareth is this little tiny place, right? And he's just like, just think of Bonnyville and Cold Lake. So it's just kind of like, someone's like, yeah, it's coming from Bonnyville. You're like, Bonnyville? Are you kidding me? Right? Sorry if you're from Bonnyville. Right, so the Cold Lake response, or the vice versa. Bonnyville would be like, Cold Lake, give me a break. Right? Are you kidding me? So that's kind of the what's going on here. And so Philip's like, well, just come and see. When Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said to him, "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Right? That's kind of cool. I mean, he said other stuff about the other guys, but wow. "How do you know me?" Nathanael asked. Jesus answered, "I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you." What? Then Nathanael declared, "Rabbi," remember, teacher, "you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Right? So he's just kind of like, how in the world is this happening? Right? How do you know me? Jesus said, "You believe because I told you, I saw you under the fig tree. You will see greater things than that." Then he added, "Very truly I tell you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." Now we'll explain what he's talking about there in a few minutes. But the Son of Man is a term that Jesus uses for himself, and it's a term from the Old Testament in Daniel, where it's talking about this one that would be coming. All right, so that's our story. So what do we take away from this story? Well, I think there's a few really neat things that we can think about. The first is that this is the first encounter with Jesus. Right? This is the first time. That's why I kind of stopped and said, let's hold on a second. Remember, these guys did not know him. They were young, and they're kind of like, what do we do? I really like this guy, but it's kind of scary, right? I don't even know what to say. And then with Philip, like the first thing he goes and finds Philip and he says, follow me, right? Now, there might have been some other conversation there. We don't know. But it's just really interesting. Like there's each of the disciples, he says something different. So he knows them all, right? He knew Nathanael. He knew Peter. And he's just like, he already knows them. It's very, very interesting. And so this first encounter, what we need to take away is that it is not a coincidence. That's why we talked about at the start when we were talking about the 12 disciples, the 12. It wasn't an accident that Jesus chose these guys. He went out looking for them. It's not an accident that they were there and Jesus was there. This is all part of God's plan. And so these 12 guys were already pre-chosen. And Jesus is going to meet them and to say, hey, follow me. Come and see. So Andrew and the other disciple, we don't know who this disciple is. Speculation is it's John who's writing the story. It's possible, probably probable that it's John. But they're intrigued by Jesus, right? This Lamb of God. And they don't know what to say. It's his first encounter, right? But they want to be with him. So all of these guys, in their first encounter with Jesus, there's something going on. There's something about this guy. There's something about this man, and I want to get to know him. He's intriguing. There's something special about him. And so they say, where are you staying? Where are you living, right? Because they just want to hang out with them, and they probably don't know what else to say. So Jesus invites the two, and it's really interesting. This is the invitation that Jesus gives them. Come and see. Like Jesus at this point could have said, hey guys, yeah, I'm the one. I'm the one that everyone's been waiting for. And he wouldn't have been arrogant. It would have just been telling them who he was, right? But he doesn't. He invites them on a journey. That's the whole come and see. It's a journey, right? He's like, come and be with me. Ultimately, they're asking where he's staying, and he's saying, come stay with me. And he's not just saying, for one day. It's like, eventually they would follow him everywhere. All right, so Andrew brings Peter to Jesus. So this is what we see in this account. We see the first part with Andrew and Peter, the come and see. Jesus gives the invitation, and then Andrew comes and brings Peter to Jesus. Now, there's something really significant about here, because in the gospel according to John, every time Andrew has a scene in the gospel of John, he's bringing someone to Jesus. Every time. Isn't that cool? It's like, oh, wow. So every account, there's not that many. He's not in there very, very much. But he's bringing someone to Jesus. It's very cool. And it starts right in the very first chapter. The very first thing he does when he meets Jesus is bring someone to meet him, to come and see. And uses the same language that Jesus said, right? Come and see. All right. And it doesn't stop there. Philip does the same thing. So Philip meets Jesus. Jesus says, follow me. What is Philip? First thing Philip does? He goes and finds Nathanael and says, come meet this guy. This is the one we've been waiting for. And Nathanael, is like, yeah, whatever. Yeah, sure. It's from Nazareth. Mm-hmm. And what does he say? He uses Jesus' own invitation. Come and see. Come and see for yourself. I think that's so cool. And so this is what happens in these first encounters. Something is happening in these guys already, where they're like, we need to get other people to come see this guy. Not just look at him, but to come and actually, we need to get to know this person. All right, so that's first encounters. The second thing we pull from this text is, and I already highlighted it, so you probably know, Jesus already sees. He sees and knows, right? When it's saying sees, so throughout this chapter, if you go, especially in this section that we're reading, saw, sight, come and see, this is repeated over and over. Sight is a major theme, right? About the eyes. So what's significant about the eyes? To be able to see. Like when there's something that's really puzzling and you finally see it, you're like, right? So I think that's kind of the imagery that we're given here. They're seeing something. And Jesus' sight is mentioned quite a bit, right? I saw you under the fig tree. Right? And Jesus uses this language, come and see. There's something really significant. And I think what's being communicated here is that Jesus sees. He knows you. He knows these guys. And it's not just them. Jesus sees you. It's not a coincidence that they were there. And it's not a coincidence that you're here today. It's not. And we'll get to that in a minute. So, of course, Nathanael's floored, right? And then he says, like, you're the Son of God. Right? This seems pretty, in our standards, you'd have been like, hey, did you look me up on Facebook? Or, right? We'd have something's fishy here, right? But of course, they didn't have that stuff. So he's just floored because Jesus is communicating. It's not just that he saw a picture of Nathanael, because he actually tells about his character. Here's someone in which so he's like, you're a man of integrity. And so what really is like just hits Nathanael is that he knows me. He knew me before this meeting. What does that say about Jesus? I think that's in your small group question, so I won't answer it. So here's another story I want to quickly tell. We see this happen again, and this happens quite a bit. We see this in John chapter 4. So Jesus goes to this well. He doesn't have a bucket, and the well's deep. He's thirsty. His disciples are off in town doing something else, going to 7-Eleven or whatever. And there's a woman there. He meets a woman there. And so he strikes up this conversation, and she eventually, through the conversation, figures out who Jesus is, because he's saying all this stuff. And she's like, what? And when she finds out, she's just like, and so what happens is, Jesus already knows who this woman is. Okay, this is just a random woman, and she's not an Israelite. She's not a Jew. She's a Samaritan. Jews and Samaritans did not get along. They did not like each other. In fact, there's a lot of hatred there. And so she goes back into town because of what Jesus had told her. He asked her where her husband was, and she's like, right, I don't have a husband. And Jesus is like, yeah, you're right. You don't have a husband. In fact, you've had 5 husbands, and the one you're with right now isn't your husband. And she's like, what? What just happened? Right? And it's just like, bing, because he sees her. And he knows her. He knew her before this meeting. It's like, so she is, and she runs back to town, tells everybody, I just met a man who told me everything I've ever done. Right? Slight exaggeration, but there you go. And so what do the people of the town do? They go out to meet Jesus because she's like, come and see. It's like, oh, wow, there it is again. Come and see. So they go out, and this is how this ends. The people come to Jesus, and they said to the woman, so after they meet with Jesus, they've talked with him a little bit, we no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Savior of the world. Right? So they heard her testimony going like, I met Jesus. And then they're like, and her invitation was to actually, not just to believe my testimony, but no, come and see. I want to take you to Jesus. So they go. It's such a cool story. It's like, wow. Right? And so what we get from this is Jesus already knows. He knows you. He knows me. He knows this woman. All right, last thing. And this is what I promised I would kind of explain that last verse. So, angels ascending and descending. What is that about? So this is what this is communicating. Jesus is the link between heaven and earth. right? So Jesus tells Nathanael that he will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. So what Jesus is doing here, he's talking to Nathanael. Nathanael knows that Jesus is referring to a story that is well known. And so this story is actually found in Genesis chapter 28. And so it's a story about Jacob. And so Jacob is doing his thing. By the way, Jacob is the father of Israel. Jacob was renamed from Jacob to Israel. Significant because God had an important role for him, right? So he gave him a new name, Israel. And so he's the father of that nation. He had 12 sons, which is why there's 12 tribes, which is why there's 12 apostles. And so he's doing his thing, and he goes to rest for the night, and there's a big rock, and puts his head on the rock. I'm like, that's a terrible pillow, but no, whatever. But he has this vision, this dream. And in the dream, there's this stairway or a ladder, if you wish. And on this ladder or stairway, angels, heaven is open. Angels are ascending and descending up and down this ladder or these stairs. And so this is the story. And through this, at the top of the ladder or the stairway is God himself, and he announces that he's actually repeating a previous promise, that through Jacob's line, through Israel, all nations would be blessed. This was first given to Abraham, who was the grandfather of Jacob. And so this is repeated to Jacob. And so this is the story that Jesus is pulling from. And so what's the significance of this? Is that this blessing that was announced is here. Notice, in Jesus' version of the story, there is no stairway, there is no ladder. Why? Because Jesus is the ladder. Jesus is the stairway. He is the link between heaven and earth. Earlier on in John chapter 1, it says that the Word, which is talking about Jesus, became flesh and came and dwelt, which means tabernacled, which I don't have time to explain, among us. He became one of us. Right? And so this is the significance. Jesus is saying, I'm here. The one that everyone's been waiting for. This is the blessing. This is how all the nations on earth will be blessed, and it will be through Jesus. All right, so that's what that means. All right, so we're going to go to our small groups, but before that, here's how we're going to here's our takeaway from this. 3 things. Don't worry, there's not a whole bunch of slides. It's this idea of come and see. First of all, and I mentioned it already, you're not here by mistake. It's not a coincidence. Why? Because Jesus sees you. He already knows you, right? He's not just seeing you for the first time and getting to know you now. He already knows you. He's already seen you. And he already loves you. And his invitation to you is to come and see. Come on a journey with me and see. See who I am, right? Secondly, Jesus is the only way to know God. This is the significance of that last statement that he makes. That there's not a whole bunch of different stairways or ladders or ways to get to God. There's only one. And that's Jesus. This is really important. The only way, if you really want to know who God is, it has to be through Jesus. And Jesus, later on in John, says that. He says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father, which means God, except through me. He's the ladder. He's the bridge. He's the stairway. It's the only way to God. It's the only way that we can know God, is through Jesus. So if you want to know God, who God is, you've got to go through Jesus. And lastly, if you've accepted Jesus' call to come and see, and you're like, yeah, I may have done that when I was little, right? Maybe 5 or 6. Maybe you did it when you were 13, maybe 16. But if you've accepted that, guess what? We have this great example of what happens when we get to come see Jesus, is we get to tell other people to come and see him. Right? Like Jesus' method is so disarming. Just come and see. Come on a journey. Just check it out. Just come and see. It's so cool. Right? Jesus is just kind of like, he's not worried about it. He's like, just come on this journey with me. And that doesn't mean try God, by the way. I tried Jesus and it didn't work. That's not what I'm talking about. It's not trying out God. That's not what he's asked. The invitation is to come with me. Come with me on this journey. Like, you'll see. And so we'll get into that a little bit more. But I just wanted to leave this, and next week we'll pick up on this theme, is that this is what happens when you meet Jesus, when you have that encounter with him, is that there is something in you that goes like, I want other people to meet him too. Right? And I know that's hard in our culture, and you're going to talk about that a little bit in your small groups. But I feel it for my neighbors. I think of them lots, pray for them lots, just kind of like, God, they need to know you. They need to meet you. And I've got to talk to them. We've actually even done Alpha with a few of them. But at the same time, it's just like, it's not up to me, right, to make them whatever. But my role is to come and see. This is who I know Jesus is. Let's come on this journey with us. And so it's quite disarming. So the one thing I want to say before we go to small group is it's not just come to youth group, by the way. I don't want that to get mistaken, or come to church. That can be one method of come and see. But mostly, this is a personal invitation into your life. Come and see what Jesus has done in my life, because he's present with me. He's changed my life completely. He's made me into a new person. So come and see that. That's kind of scary, but that's what he's done. He's made me into a new person. I'm a different person. His presence is with me. And so that's part of that invitation. So it's not necessary. You can invite them to youth. And this, by the way, I just felt like I needed to say this. It's not a pitch to kind of, you got to bring all your friends to youth. It might be, but more, what I really want you to take away from this is this idea that you've met Jesus. He's amazing. He's intriguing. He's incredible. Now, it's time to ask him, and if you don't have that desire, it's time to ask him, Lord, I want that desire. Can you give that to me so that I can invite others, so that they can come and see you too?